Welcome to today's class, the Bible, or today's lecture, I should say, the Bible and Assyria. Hopefully, it'll be a very interesting and enlightening class for you, or lecture, again, excuse me. We're going to begin with asking some questions, but before we do that, I want to tell you what this class, what this lecture, it is a class, but this particular lecture is about. We're going to talk about the critical and scholarly views on the Bible. I'm not a religious teacher, and I don't plan on making this a religious class. Of course, we're looking at the Assyrian people, and we're kind of contextualizing the story of Assyria within various works in history. We're going to talk about Western authors and their views towards Assyria early on. We're going to talk about Assyrians and their views toward their own people shaped by others, and so on and so forth. So we're going to talk about critical and scholarly views on the Bible, have a gloss on that, talk about a couple of incidents in history or episodes in history, and see how the various schools of thought, if you will, biblical schools of thought, think about these episodes of Assyrian history. What's the point of this? We began this class talking about how Assyrians were perceived in both scholarly works, in textual material dating back in time, and also in the public view. So we last time went over how there is this perception of the Assyrians as being overly cruel and ruthless.
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
And lacking in any sort of culture or contribution to the world. And also the Assyrians being, for example, not the descendants of the ancient Assyrians. So today we're going to talk about the critical and scholarly views on the Bible. We're going to talk about how the Bible views the Assyrians. What's the purpose of that? Because we want to see the nexus between what the biblical sources said and later Western authors, their views on Assyrian history, and also public historians and religious leaders. For example, I gave you a quote from one of the people that has, I should say, pretensions to being a religious teacher, who said the Assyrians were the terrorists of the ancient world, and every terrorist in the world is a descendant of the Assyrians. So where do these views come from? Do they come from biblical sources? Is that an accurate assessment? Well, if you were to ask this person who made that statement, he would say, certainly, that's where I get my sources from. So we're going to look at how scholars view the Bible, how the Bible views the Assyrians, and the historical accuracy or reasonableness of those views. But before we begin, I want to ask my assistants, Sarah and Pierre, if Pierre has been able to join us. If not, we will go on with this question. But I often hear from various people about the relevance of the Bible in their lives with regard to historical episodes. So I want to ask Sarah, do you think the Bible holds relevance in terms of looking at history? In other words, do you or others that you know, your family, your friends, and so on, look through Assyrian history or look at Assyrian history through the lens of the Bible? Or do you think really that the Bible is more relevant for spiritual understanding and growth? In other words, do you use it as the person that I talked about? He viewed Assyrians as terrorists, or another one would say, well, they're overly cruel, and that's what the Bible says. Is that how you look at the Assyrians, through that lens, or do you look at the Bible as not necessarily a historical, analytical tool?
Thank you. Those are great questions. I think growing up, when I was younger, I definitely viewed history mostly through a biblical lens. I grew up in a very religious household. But really, one of my earliest memories of even learning about Assyria actually comes from an old animated children's show that depicted, Bible stories. And I remember there was this episode about Jonah and the people of Nineveh. And in that story, we know Jonah was, very hesitant to preach to the Assyrians because they were known for their cruelty, and the show, depicted the Assyrians as such. And at the time, obviously, as a kid, that's really all I took from the story and what I knew of Assyrians. But as I got older, I mean, naturally, I started delving into more research that kind of changed that for me. But I kind of see how biblical texts, and while spiritually meaningful, sure, were primarily built on theological and moral narratives. I think this is a basic point. And I don't think it really is meant to act as a historical textbook by any means and necessarily capture the complexity of a grand historical picture. And, the Bible has an interpretive nature surrounding it. But I wouldn't say you know, that the Bible isn't relevant. It absolutely is for many of us, especially for moral and spiritual guidance. But I also agree that the Bible, in a way, contains an outline, sure, an outline of historical narratives, but I think biblical writers were just more concerned with conveying messages of religious truths and offering theological interpretations of certain events. I don't necessarily think these contradict the Bible per se, but more so it provides a nuanced picture of the Assyrians, sure. So for me, I guess I mean, it remains important, but I think it's the tool I use to think about history. I guess it's a starting point to dig a bit deeper. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And I would encourage you all to kind of think about that question. And as Sarah said, sort of give your own, as Sarah gave, give your own interpretation as to the relevance of the Bible as a historical document. Now, when we say the Bible, of course, we Assyrians refer to it as Kitawe Qadisha when we're referring to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. We say Kitawe Qadisha in the plural. We say holy books. So it's clearly not one book. So I asked the second question, Sarah. What do you think of the kind of overall Bible's overall message concerning the Assyrians, and how should the Assyrians view this? Now, I asked this question, um, and you don't have to answer it now, Sarah, by the way. But let's go through the class, and I want to hear also from others. But I really would like to um, understand, like, when people say we view the Bible this way, the Bible views the Assyrians this way, and this is my understanding. My question is always, where do you get that? Where is that source that you're talking about? In other words, do you have a certain reference point that you're working from, or are you working based on a commentary or a particular Bible? And the story of Jonah, I recall my son when he was very young in school, Asher Bunny Paul, who's with us today, um, came back and he was very upset because he did hear about in school how mean the Assyrians were, or how bad the people of Nineveh were, and that really bothered him as a child. I don't want to say he was traumatized by the experience, but it was certainly a very bad experience. And um, hearing about your ancestors as sort of evil, and that's all you hear. You don't hear about other things about the Assyrians. All that people know about the Assyrians were that they were very ruthless, and so on and so forth, as we've discussed in this class, is, I would say, debilitating and demoralizing for a lot of people. So one of the things we're going to do is kind of look at historical events from the archaeological and textual viewpoint, like, from the other sources, let's say. Not that we wholeheartedly believe in every single text that is written from the time of the Assyrians, but we want to see what the views are of the Assyrians themselves. So keep these questions in mind as we go through this class. Now, as to the history of the Old Testament, which deals with the Assyrians and mentions the Assyrians, as we'll see, there are various schools. Two very prominent schools are what we refer to as the minimalists and the maximalists. The minimalists are skeptical of the historicity of the Bible and often say, and we'll see a number of authors today say that much of the Bible is written in the post-exilic period, which is way past what we think of. In other words, during the Persian and Hellenistic times rather than in the older times. The maximalists, and we will see a couple of them today. I'll introduce you to a couple. Elad Mazar, the late Elad Mazar, who passed away in 2021, who is an Israeli historian, rather nationalistic when it comes to understanding the Bible, and Richard Hess, who graduated from Wheaton College, comes from kind of an evangelical background. So we have to hear all their voices and understand the way they think about various episodes. Thomas Thompson is known for his very prominent role in the Copenhagen School of Minimalism, and he is a highly educated person in Hebrew, Aramaic, and other ancient languages. And he has done many works on the ancient period. And he has something to say about Assyrian history as well. Now, his criticism of the Old Testament, so that he says, well, you can't take it literally, is that this movement, this is based on an interview he did, grows out of a failure of biblical archaeology's effort to provide a critical history of Israel. And he tells us that the development in critical biblical studies, which came to reject the use of biblical narrative as a historical description of past events, became called minimalism because these scholars did not share the assumption of, for example, biblical archaeologists. The whole thing of biblical archaeology was doubted, in fact, that history could be written by bringing together evidence from these narratives in the Bible and archaeological evidence. These people, such as this particular scholar, saw the Bible as allegorical, I mean, storytelling basically, and separated the use of archaeology from the Bible to write the history of that land, often referring to it as Palestine. This is not a political movement. It's a movement to view the Old Testament as an allegorical work rather than a historical work. So one of the things that Thompson says is the Hebrew Bible is not a historical account, but rather a collection of literary and theological myths written primarily in the Persian and Hellenistic period, as we said. So long after after the exile period when people of Judah were sent out of their land. Most of what it narrates about early Israel and the patriarchs and the Exodus and the monarchy is not historically reliable and has little or no basis to actual events. And partly the split, the understanding here is that there's a difference between Judah and Israel. These were two different states. And as we will see, the Israelites at one point were in conflict with Assyria when Judah was not. And then at other times, Judah was in conflict with Assyria when Israel was not. So the two were not the same entities historically. Another minimalist is Davies, Philip Davies. He received his PhD from Oxford. has done a lot, has written a lot of works on biblical studies. And along with Thompson, he's also a member of kind of the Copenhagen school of minimalism, which has been named by others, not by themselves, because they're very critical of reading the Bible as a historical document. And his conclusion is that the Hebrew Bible is primarily a product of Persian or Hellenistic periods, also written by post-exilic scribes who invented or reworked Israel's past to construct, or Judah's past to construct a national identity for a community of Judeans in and around Jerusalem. Post-exilic, so post-exile period from Jerusalem. Another well-noted minimalist is Israel Finkelstein, who's done a lot of work in Israel, archaeological work. And there are a number of films that feature him talking about the conclusions that he makes. He highlights in a lot of these films and a lot of these interviews, for example, the conclusions that biblical archaeologists have made. This was Solomon's place of work. This was where Solomon kept his horses, and so on and so forth. And he's shown through historical evidence that this is not the case, and that a lot of what was found and labeled as historical, kind of related to the historical narrative within the Old Testament, is in fact not that. It is something else. His point is, I'm not going to work from looking at the what the scribes wrote long after it happened and trying to match it to archaeological evidence. I'm going to look at the archaeological evidence, and then I'm going to make my conclusions based on that. Whatever textual and other evidence exists, we will look at it, but we're going to look primarily at the archaeology. And some of what he has said in the past, his key work is The Bible Unearthed, is that Jerusalem in the 10th century was a small, unfortified village, not the capital of an empire. He does not really believe in the Solomonic empire or Solomonic state. He does not believe in the idea of a united monarchy under David and Solomon. So his conclusions are that David and Solomon may have existed, although there is no evidence of their existence, but their reigns were modest and localized. The biblical image of a great empire is theological and nationalistic retrojection, not something based on what we have found. Now, to counter the ideas and the writings of Israel Finkelstein are people like Eilat Mazar, who passed away in 2021, as I said. And she's done a lot of excavations, and she's come to hasty conclusions about what these excavations meant. And for example, she claimed to discover that a large stone structure and stepped stone structure was identified as David's palace. Now, how she came to that conclusion, it's not entirely clear, but the biblical account of David and Solomon, according to Mazar, as rulers of a centralized monarchy, is historically plausible and supported by archaeological remains in Jerusalem. In agreement with Mazar as to the historicity of the Old Testament is Richard Hess, who's educated in, as I said, Wheaton College, and who's an evangelical figure. And he is currently teaching at Denver Seminary. And he focuses on the Old Testament and, of course, is also aware of Semitic languages. And his conclusion is that we can affirm the historicity and reliability of the Old Testament, arguing that while it reflects a theological perspective, he's saying, fine, it does reflect that, that's true, but we can by and large relate to it. Although he's very careful with certain events, and we're going to mention a couple of these events in history. But he maintains that the Old Testament should not be dismissed as a myth or fiction because it has much more historical truth than we give it credit for. But that is criticized by others, such as Israel Finkelstein and Davies and Thompson. And their point of contention is that for all of this stuff, we're really lacking in archaeological corroboration, archaeological evidence. It's really lacking. Also, that I'm going to just say a couple of these things. And there are more people saying this now than ever before because of the style of literature produced in the Old Testament really seems to be much more from the post-exilic period rather than from before. So the judgment here on the part of many of these scholars who could be categorized as minimalists is that the style of the Bible, the lack of archaeological evidence for what is being said in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and the fact that it seems to refer to many historical events as if they were written long before, as if they occurred long before, and the recording is much later, all tells us that there's a big question mark on the reliability of this historical record, as it were. Of course, there are many approaches. I don't want to belabor this point, but there are many approaches to studying the Bible and the historical critical, the literary, so on and so forth, the minimalist, maximalist that we talked about, social scientific. There are many things to dig up in these various books, these Kitab Qadisha, as they're referred by Assyrians, that one can find, allegorical tales, and so on and so forth. Many, many items. But our interest really is how does the Bible view the Assyrian people and Assyrian history, which is of import to the Assyrian people. The Assyrians are mentioned in the Bible about 120 to 130 times. They're one of the most frequently mentioned of foreign powers and have a very important role in the Bible. The empire has a dominant role as a tool of God, as it were, and it is an important political force. And if true that what the minimalists say is that a lot of what was written in the Old Testament is much later, then it gives us all the more, one could say the Assyrian power was so influential, so impactful on the minds of a lot of these people, on the collective memory of those who later wrote the Bible, that this is an indication of how significant the Assyrian Empire was. And the key books that refer to the Assyrians are the Kings in Kings 2, excuse me, that talk about various Assyrian kings, and these are reliable. Sargon II, Tiglath-Pileser was referred to as Pul, Sennacherib. Isaiah, of course, refers to Assyria's role as the rod of God's anger, and Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem in there. Jonah, which we mentioned before and which Sarah also referred to. Nahum, which is a prophecy against Nineveh. Nahum, whose reputedly his grave is in the tiny village of Elqush next to Nineveh. Hosea, Micah, Zephaniah, references to Assyrian threats and judgment, and Ezekiel. These are just some of the places that the Assyrians are mentioned of having a prominent role in the Bible. What about the Chaldeans? Because oftentimes a lot of people say, well, we've never heard of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are also mentioned, but the term primarily refers to later historical and prophetic books, and it is associated with the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the role of the Babylonian exile. And this is an indication also for the minimalists that the entire reference to Chaldeans is really from, and especially Ur of the Chaldees, which we will discuss, is indicative of these books in the Bible being written much later than we thought. In other words, post Babylon, Persian, Hellenistic times. Now let's look at a couple of examples which have become very important for a lot of people and have caused much debate and consternation for Assyrians. One of them is Sennacherib's campaign to Judah, when Sennacherib comes up, destroys a lot of the cities of Judah, conquers most of it, and lays siege to Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, not the capital of Israel, remember. Now, many authors have opined on the study of Sennacherib's campaign, and there's a question of whether it occurred in history, and most scholars do agree that it occurred in. So, what I want to say is that there are various scholars that look at this, and some are in agreement that by and large, the historical record shares some themes with the writings of the Old Testament, whereas the minimalists would say no. It's really dangerous to kind of tie these together. Archaeological evidence does not bear out. Certainly, the divine intervention part, it makes no sense. So, well, what do these scholars look at? So, if we look at the history, and we're going to study a lot of Western authors like George Gordon, who is known as Lord Byron, what they said about the Assyrians. And of course, what comes out of the mouths of Lord Byron and others is that the Assyrians stood for evil and oppression and so on and so forth in the Bible, and that kind of transferred over later to other writers. Um, we'll go into more deep detail of that, but I think it's important to also hear from the sources of the Assyrians themselves. Now, Sennacherib's view of himself is that he was guardian of the right, lover of justice, who lends support, who comes to the aid of the weak. This is a very familiar theme, by the way, with um, many Mesopotamian rulers and Assyrian rulers. Certainly Hammurabi in his code says that he is protecting the weak from the strong. And this goes back to a tradition in ancient Sumer and other places. So this is a very familiar theme, is that the king, when he is strong, he is also a helper of the weak. He looks after the weak. Um, what we're saying is this is the vision that Sennacherib had of himself. That's not to say that he will not punish people. Of course, he does. Now, at the time that he was around, Sennacherib, it's important to know the kingdoms that were in this area in the South Levant and Mid Levant. And what had happened is that the kingdom of Israel, there was kingdom of Israel, Judah, there was the states of Philistine, and there was a gentleman by the name of Padi, little king in this area. Once there was a rebellion against the Assyrians after Sennacherib came to power, there was the formation of a coalition of armies, most likely supported by Egypt, to overthrow the Assyrian power in this area. Of course, much of this is done for economic reasons, to gain a foothold in this area, economic and security reasons, just like now. Egypt had political interests in fomenting rebellion, and Assyria, of course, wanted to keep its domination of the area. So the former vassal of the Assyrian Empire, which had been hitherto loyal to the Assyrians, rebelled, and there seemed to be, according to Sennacherib, some kind of coordination, some kind of conspiracy between his enemies in southern Mesopotamia and Elam, and Hezekiah and others in the South Levant. Sennacherib refers to it as a kitru or qitru, an unholy alliance. So the first campaign, Sennacherib goes to Elam and Babylonia, or Cardunesh, in the city of Babylon, and seizes power there again. The Assyrians had domination in these areas. Oftentimes, they would lose the domination to the influence of others. So there is conquest. Now, Sennacherib straightens things out. In his second campaign, he goes into areas he claims his ancestors had not gone into Iran, and quells rebellions there and brings submissiveness of those people um, to the Assyrians, to his capital in Nineveh. And in the third campaign, he heads to the Levant, where the story in the Bible takes place. The king of Sidon flees, and Sennacherib says that he fled into the sea. Um, Other cities of the Levant surrender. Sidon is taken and Byblos is taken. Of course, they will rebel again. Moab, Eden, and various kingdoms pay tribute. The king of Ashkelon, who had not paid tribute, is taken as a prisoner to Assyria with his family. And an Assyrian is placed in his place. Now, when we talk about the Assyrians, again, I have to refer to the perception of many Western authors is that they were overly cruel and they had no sense of justice and no sense of mercy and no compassion for other people. But this passage, although Sennacherib metes out justice to people who had done him wrong, the governors and nobles of Ekron arrested Padi, who was loyal to the Assyrians, king of Ekron, and handed him over to Hezekiah, who has placed him in chains as if he was an enemy. Well, Sennacherib makes him come out of Jerusalem, not by conquering Jerusalem, and this is very important, and a number of authors have written on this, but by diplomacy and pressure and perhaps various forms of influence, perhaps economic pressure, perhaps threat of violence. And Padi is released. He is placed on his throne again, and the people who had punished Padi, the governors and nobles, who had formed a union with Egypt and Cush, forces without number, he's telling us, are punished and defeated. And the Assyrians eventually win. He tells us, I assaulted Ekron and killed the officials and patricians who had committed the crime and hung their bodies on poles surrounding the city. The common citizens who were guilty of minor crimes, I considered prisoners of war. The rest of them, those who were not accused of crimes and misbehavior, I released. I made Padi their king, come from Jerusalem, and set him as their lord on the throne, imposing upon him the tribute due to me as the overlord. So Sennacherib claims victory. And in order to understand kind of this episode, it's not a judgment against the Assyrians in the Bible. There is in Isaiah a kind of a cry against Judah by the Lord speaking from the prophets. Oh, rebellious children, says the Lord, who carry out a plan, but not mine, who make an alliance, but against my will, adding sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my counsel, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore, the protection of Pharaoh shall become your shame, and the shelter in the shadow of Egypt, your humiliation. So this doesn't sound like a condemnation of the Assyrians, excuse me. It sounds more like a condemnation of the people of Judah. And I'm not going to go over the entire story here, but the bottom line is that Sennacherib according to most authors who are careful scholars or historians, would see that he got what he wanted in Judah. He spared Jerusalem, but with heavy taxation, the king in Jerusalem, Hezekiah, gave what he needed to give to Sennacherib, and everything else was okay in that area. The Egyptians had been defeated. The Assyrians must have been exhausted from this campaign and went back to Assyria. Well, we know the Assyrians were not defeated because next year, or the after the fall of or after the termination of the reign of Sennacherib, his son Sarhaddon comes to this area, and then his grandson Ashurbanipal. So, from the biblical point of view, however, the Assyrians were thwarted in conquering Jerusalem, not the other cities of Judah, but Jerusalem in this period, and for a short time, because later, of course, Jerusalem falls to Nebuchadnezzar II, the king of Babylon. Now, it's important to know that Sennacherib was not just someone we can categorize as a horrible, horrible person, as he has been in various writings. He's not some Genghis Khan who was not responsible for any building projects. He, in fact, created some waterworks and took a lot of pride in his building activities in the heartland of Assyria, and took care of his cities, took great care over his palaces. His palace, called Palace Without Rival, created what we think of as the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh rather than the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Left us a lot of writing. How reliable, of course, we have to categorize as a bit of propaganda, but that's the nature of empires. And the discovery of his innovation has shown that Sennacherib was a very important king and a very responsible administrator, rather than as someone who was sort of a barbaric figure in history. Now, that's one episode that is kind of important to think about. So we have the two views concerning what happened with Judah and what happened in Jerusalem. There was the Assyrian view, the historical view, and the biblical view. What about Ur of the Chaldees? Because this has become an important topic of discussion among many people. Now, for some Assyrians or Chaldeans, the this issue has more than mere historical reference. It's a reference point for identity. And for Bishop Sarhad Jammu, the late Bishop Sarhad Jammu, who passed away a little while ago, he refers to Abraham as the Chaldean Abraham of Ur. In other words, because he came out of Ur of the Chaldees, Abraham takes on an ethnicity that is ours, that we are, because we are Chaldeans, we refer back to our father Abraham as being coming from our land and coming from southern Mesopotamia, where the formation of the Chaldean people took place. So is this, and of course he ties it to the rest of Christians in Iraq. This patrimony is tied to everybody, and is kept by primarily the Chaldean church. Now, the maximalist view of Ur of the Chaldees is that even for Richard Hess, who is a maximalist, this term Ur of the Chaldees is a little bit troubling. And why is that? And he's very cautionary in his understanding of this very term. Why? Because Ur was a Sumerian city. The formation of what we came to know as Chaldeans came much later than Ur. So Ur of the Chaldees, or Ur of the Chaldeans, was an anachronistic understanding. And that is what Davies and Thompson and others say, is that the Chaldeans in the Bible, the view that the Chaldeans in the Bible, not as accurate historical reference to a group known during the time of Abraham or early Israel, but as a retrospective projection from much later periods. Okay, and again, remember the minimalist view, the writings coming from the period of the post-exilic period, so Hellenistic, Achaemenid, or post fall of Babylon period. In this view, references to the Chaldeans or Chassidim reflect the historical experiences and theological concerns of exilic and post-exilic Judeans, not ancient memories. All right, so we dealt with these two issues in the Bible and how they relate to Assyrian history. The final question here is, are the Assyrians inherently cruel and damned in the Bible? This is a question that we have to ask ourselves. So we see historians, public historians, and others talk about Assyrians and say things like, well, we get it from the Bible. You know, the Bible condemns the Assyrians. And this has even, by the way, penetrated the minds of many Assyrians. Many Assyrian preachers would say the Assyrians were damned. And where were they getting this information from? They were getting it from Western interpreters of the Bible who would say that's what happened. The Assyrians were very bad indeed, and God punished them, and that's why you're in this situation today. But if we ask this question, what's the answer? I would say no. The Bible often depicts Assyrians as the instruments of God's judgment rather than evil for their own sake. So nowhere in the Bible does it say that the Assyrians were inherently evil. Yes, there's our references to kings and the actions of kings and the actions of empire and brutality that every empire engaged in, but there is nothing inherently evil about the Assyrians in the Bible. Nothing. The key point is that the people and nations who disobey or oppose God's will are subject to punishment in the Bible. That has nothing to do with the Assyrians per se. So the key points we can take away is the Assyrians in the Bible are agents of divine judgment, and they acted according to how God wanted them to act. Individual and national responsibility. The Bible's moral framework is that disobedience to God's covenant brings consequences. That's what the text is about. Consequences are the result of you not following the law of God. And that's in large part also a punishment against Israel and Judah in the Bible, not necessarily the just the Assyrians. I mean, anyone who transgresses the law is punished. Descriptions of cruelty reflect historical reality and prophetic rhetoric. And there's a great book by Steven Pinker called Better Angels, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is very interesting, and I will bring up in this class, that discusses the cruelty in the writings of the ancient Greeks in the medieval times and even in biblical times that has nothing to do with the Assyrians. So this was in other words, according to Steven Pinker, who's a psychologist, and according to others, this was a common theme in history: cruelty of people, divine sovereignty, and moral order. In prophetic books, Isaiah and Nahum, Assyria's rise and fall are depicted with God's sovereign plan. Assyria rises as an instrument of judgment, but will itself be judged. This shows a cycle of accountability for all nations, including Assyria. And now, if you ask, well, what about Nineveh? You know, the destruction of Nineveh happened, but this is very common in the Bible. And we look at the condemnation of Nineveh, of Jerusalem, of Babylon, of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Tyre and Sidon, Samaria, Moab, Edom, Philistia, and other places, Damascus. It isn't simply Assyria that is targeted for punishment because the Assyrians happen to be evil. That's not what the Bible is saying. It's not what the Hebrew Bible is certainly saying. And I'll end on this note. This is a very interesting quote. We talked about the minimalists of the Bible, the people who look at the Bible as a source of reference, but not necessarily adhere to it as a historical source. And we look at the maximalists who view it in other ways, more prominence. Um, and we looked at a couple of episodes, the episode of Sennacherib and his experience with Judah, and specifically Jerusalem in the Bible, and the Bible's view of the angel of the Lord coming, and other archaeological evidence showing that there was a battle outside. And there's, by the way, archaeological evidence shows Assyrian activity in Judah at this time. Um, and Isaiah tells us, and I'll end on this note, in that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. The Assyrians will go to Egypt and the Egyptians to Assyria. The Egyptians and the Assyrians will worship together. In that day, Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance." So here's a view of the Bible that brings together the salvation for all three nations. It isn't necessarily condemning the Assyrians as evil. To the contrary, calling the Assyrians his handiwork, okay, God's handiwork, and not condemning the Assyrians as evil uh, terrorists, as one particular author has said. I have fun with that author, but I think it's very important to know where are his sources, and so far we have not really found them in the Bible.